Dr. Nardi here, back with another video. And in this video, we are going to talk about intelligence and a little bit of other cognitive functioning. So we're going to focus on intelligence, and we're going to talk about what intelligence is. Is it simply genetics? Is it based on your upbringing and how you were raised and how your parents, took care of you as a child? Is it about developmental trajectories? Is it about purely hard work? Is it about opportunities? Or is it a mixture of all of these? To find out, stay tuned to this video. And if you have not done so already, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And if you have interesting things to say, leave a comment below. Okay, to talk about intelligence, we have to kind of come up with the definition of intelligence, and we have to define intelligence, which, by the way, is not an easy thing to do. Because as you'll see in this video, there are a lot of different definitions of intelligence. But I will talk about one common consensus generally amongst researchers is we kind of look at intelligence as the ability to reason, to understand, and to profit from experience. Now, again, this is an approximate consensus because if we actually got into every definition of intelligence, it would vary wildly, but I will discuss some of the definitions in this video today. So what does intelligence mean? Well, you might have heard of IQ, and that just simply stands for intelligence quotient. And it's a standard measure of intelligence. And the original test was actually produced, or you could calculate your IQ by using your mental age score, which was divided by the chronological age and multiplied by 100. Now, tests don't really do that anymore, and newer tests subsequently have restructured and extended to adults, because originally all the IQ tests were really focused on children. And the first intelligence test was devised by Alfred Binet in about 1905. And this was to identify French school children who needed special instruction. Predicting school performance remains the most effective use of intelligence tests. Another thing to note is that IQ scores are positively correlated to job performance, income, and socioeconomic status. And remember, positive correlation means as one goes up, the other goes up. So generally speaking, individuals with higher IQs make more money, have higher job performance, and are in a higher socioeconomic status. Now, there is a correlation between juvenile delinquency and intelligence, and that's negatively correlated. So usually, the lower someone scores on IQ, the higher their juvenile delinquency will be, and vice versa. Intelligence is highly stable into adulthood, meaning whatever intelligence you have when you're a kid really stays the same, excluding some kind of brain trauma, or we'll talk about the aging process and its negative effects on intelligence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, intelligence is positively correlated to academic performance and high socioeconomic levels. However, critics would argue that the tests were designed to reflect that kind of success, so the tests might be a little biased. Critics argue that tests may overemphasize verbal ability and education and Western culture. Now, there have been a few intelligence tests that have been designed to be quote-unquote culture-free, like the Raven progressive matrices. Now, these tests are mostly nonverbal, and the tasks they ask you to do require no experience with a particular culture. I would like to point out that there are multiple settings where what we call street smarts exceeds conventional intelligence. And some examples of that, like a street vendor makes really quick, rapid financial calculations. However, they fail to do that in a classroom setting. So sometimes when it's more applied, people do better on some of these intelligence metrics. Sternberg, a famous researcher in the field, argues that intelligence might be a cultural construct that really helps explain why some people can survive better than other individuals. Now, if you take a look at the chart on the screen, you'll notice that there is a range of IQ scores, with 100 being right there in the middle, That's being our average IQ score for the population. And if you notice that if you go one standard deviation above the mean, which would be 115, or you go one standard deviation below the mean, it's 85. But if you notice one thing, that most people cluster right around the mean, so about either one standard deviation above or one standard deviation below the mean. So you could argue that the average intelligence is somewhere between 85 and 115 in most of the population. And the farther you go out from the average intelligence score, so if you go to 130 or even 145, the less and less likely there are to have those scores. The same thing if you go to 70 or 55, it's much, much less likely to encounter those individuals. So really super gifted people are hard to find, and those who have a mental disability are also less of the population, with most of everybody falling around 100, with the exception of myself, about 145. I'm actually just kidding. Maybe I'm not. Now, even amongst intelligence researchers, there are arguments. There is a debate, I should say, not argument. But the debate really is whether intelligence is one single capability, or is it a collection of several independent abilities? Now, intelligence theories tend to fall into one of the two groups. We call these lumpers or splitters. Now, lumpers claim that intelligence is a single unitary capability, which is usually called the general factor or simply G factor. They concede there are separate abilities that somewhat vary in strength, but they place greater weight on the G or general intelligence. General intelligence is often assessed by the overall IQ score from traditional tests such as the Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale, whose 11 subsets measure more specific abilities, but they really focus on that general ability. Other researchers prefer to use other tests, like the one I mentioned earlier, which is the Raven Progress Matrices, because they emphasize reasoning and problem solving, and they are relatively freer of the influence from specific abilities, such as verbal skills. Splitters, on the other hand, hold that intelligence is made up of several mental abilities that are more or less independent of each other. IQ subtests are of the greatest interest to these individuals. These theorists cite cases of brain damage in which one capability is impaired without affecting others. So they argue it's not just one general intelligence, but it's made up of multiple discrete subsets. So now you might be wondering, what's the relationship between the brain, the physical brain, and intelligence? Now, people often think of a very famous genius, Albert Einstein. And they actually measured and looked at Albert Einstein's brain, and they noticed that his brain was below average in weight and had an average number of neurons. And it was only different from a typical brain in a few distinct ways. Now, each of Einstein's hemispheres was a full centimeter wider than those of the control brain. And this could be due to the larger parietal lobes. And there were intriguing variations in some of the parietal gyri. Now, think back to a previous video or of what you read. The parietal lobes are involved with mathematical ability and visual spatial processing, these two things that Einstein really excelled at. One thing you should also note, as brain regions can develop volume over use. For example, taxi drivers with enlarged posterior hippocampi really have those because they navigate a lot. So those kind of enlarge with use. So in context, this doesn't necessarily mean that Einstein was more intelligent or that the parietal lobes are directly associated with intelligence. It could be because of use. Now, some researchers propose that general intelligence may be located in the prefrontal cortex because it's activated in both verbal and spatial tests of intelligence. But in reality, it's probably more complex than what just happens in one area of the brain and involves multiple brain regions. Now, researchers have studied the brains of hundreds of individuals with brain damage and were able to correlate the location of their lesions with the scores on a set of intelligence subsets that really measured that G or that G factor, or that general intelligence. The researchers suggest that G is the brain's ability to pull together different kinds of processing, which is dependent on the quality of the connection between areas. Connectivity is highly heritable. It's up to 84% in some parts of the brain. So you might be wondering to yourself, what is the link between brain size and intelligence? Well, there is a link, I guess, that is technically true. And that's the best kind of true, is technically. I'm just kidding. But to some extent, it's a correlation about 0.24, which is very weak. It's a very weak correlation. The brain size comparison breaks down into separate species, as elephants have much larger brains, but by most people's accounts, they are less intelligent than humans. The amount of gray matter is somewhat more predictive of intelligence, with a correlation of 0.37, and white matter is somewhat less related at 0.26. IQ is more strongly correlated to gray matter in men and white matter in women, suggesting a broadly distributed network that accommodates different strategies in male and female cognition. Now, you also might have heard, what about processing speed and efficiency? All the gray matter in the world would be useless without the white matter connections that make the brain's communication network. White matter efficiency is the shortest or the directness of connections which increase processing speed. This measure is highly related to intelligence and educational achievement. Nerve conduction velocity determines both reaction time and indirectly intellect. So this in turn depends on white matter integrity, or the ability of the axon wall and its myelin insulation to prevent diffusion of fluid out of the axon. White matter integrity is also correlated with intelligence and explains about 10% of its variance. A surprising finding in studies of the brain's role in intelligence is that individuals with a higher IQ score use less brain energy when they are solving problems. Now let's talk about specific abilities and general intelligence. Now, the inventor of factor analysis, by the way, this is a statistical method, and his name was Charles Spearman, in case you're wondering, was the first to try to identify clusters of abilities that are more closely related with each other than with others. He found that all measures were strongly related enough to support the notion of a G factor in intelligence, or a general factor. However, there are groups of even stronger correlations linked to approximately 3 components of intelligence, which would be linguistics, logical/mathematical, and spatial abilities. Now, several authors have argued that each of these cognitive abilities depends on a complex network or module in the brain that has evolved in ways that support that function. Some go even further, suggesting that these capabilities, such as mathematics and language, are hardwired into the brain. In any case, complex intelligence problems activate a broad span of brain structures across the brain, and this typically varies by task. Few of these structures are specifically dedicated to these intelligence problems. However, Wynne argued that the brain has specialized mechanisms for numbers by pointing to evidence that even infants and lower primates seem to have an inborn ability to estimate quantities. And he argues that intelligence is not uniquely human, that animals have intelligence too. According to parieto-frontal integration theory, general intelligence depends on how well the parietal and frontal brain networks integrate with each other. They found that parietal areas abstract sensory information and integrate it. Afterwards, the parietal areas interface with the frontal areas to evaluate the process information. Now, another theory out there is the network neuroscience theory. And this theory argues that differences in general intelligence are related to the brain's ability to reconfigure networks on the fly in order to allow cognitive flexibility and adaptation and problem solving. Now you might be wondering, what is the role of the environment and intelligence? So we could say that environment is responsible for about half of all intelligence differences. Although some of these environmental differences are still unclear, but if we wanted to talk about hereditability of intelligence, we could generally conclude that IQ is more similar among closely related individuals, even if family members are separated early in life. We could look at identical twins reared apart, and they have more similar IQs than fraternal twins who were reared together. Now, researchers have documented genetic influences on several of the functions that contribute to intelligence, including working memory, processing speed, and reaction time in making choices. Heredity also accounts for most of the differences among individuals in the major structural contributors to intelligence. In one twin study, the estimate of heritability was about 90% for brain volume, 82% for gray matter, and 88% for white matter. Genes are also linked to intelligence with brain size. So cortical thickness and the integrity of major pathways is also linked to genetics. Now, if we want to talk about the environment, it has been extremely difficult to identify environmental conditions that influence intelligence, other than those conditions that result in brain damage. Like individual genes, the environmental influences on intelligence are large in number and weak in individual effect. Environmental factors are often intertwined with genetics, and we can get into the conversation of epigenetics and the role of the environment influencing your genes and your genes influencing your environment. Usually the best way we can demonstrate environmental influences is by experimental intervention. Interventions that may occur early in life, at early ages, are more effective in producing lasting IQ changes. Now, while adopted children have an IQ that is more highly correlated with the intelligence of their biological parents than with the intelligence of their adopted parents, the drastic change in environment does affect an overall IQ score. So, as I said, we can never rule out the influence of the environment on your genes and your genes' influence on your environment. It's a very complex conversation and a little bit beyond this video. With that said, I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, and comment below. And I'll see you all next time. Take care. Bye-bye.